There is a group of people who over the last few years have increasingly been painted as internal enemies who are part of a grand conspiracy to subvert the societies in which they live. Concurrent with this, another related group of people, despite quite clearly being downtrodden, materially deprived, and attacked in the worst ways possible, are being painted as somehow actually globally influential, in control of many powerful institutions and even entire countries behind the scenes, essentially playing chess with the world to mislead them. The image of them as victims, we are led to believe, is actually false. They themselves are the victimizers, and those who are attacking them are doing the rest of us a favor. We simply cannot see the full reality. We are blinded to it, because they are behind everything. The two groups of people that I'm talking about here are Muslim and Arab migrants to Western countries, and the Palestinians, primarily in Gaza, but also in general around the world. And it's becoming increasingly common to see these groups framed in the ways that Nazis framed different groups of Jews in World War II. The Muslims of Europe are being framed as they frame the Jews of Germany, and the Palestinians are being framed largely by Israel and its supporters, similarly to how the Nazis framed the Jews of Eastern Europe, who despite being largely just as poor and downtrodden as everyone else, were nonetheless framed ridiculously as co-conspirators in some sort of grand, global, anti-German conspiracy. Anti-Semitic tropes are being repurposed one-to-one. Supposedly left-wing politicians in Europe are framing Muslim and Arab migrants as a sort of internal enemy, and Zionists are telling us that clearly very weak Palestinian militant groups are somehow actually far more powerful than we could ever perceive, with their influence being so pervasive that even some of the world's premier global organizations like the UN do their bidding, and sometimes that they are even controlling or at least darkly influencing entire countries of tens of millions of people, something which quite clearly Palestinians in general, let alone singular Palestinian militant groups, do not even remotely have the power or the means to achieve. And in this way, very worryingly, anti-Semitism is being utilized to much greater effect against Muslims, Arabs and Palestinians today than it is being utilized against Jews themselves. There are very much mainstream anti-Muslim political campaigns in Europe when there are not really any mainstream anti-Jewish campaigns. And Israel's assault on Gaza, which has killed upwards of 60,000 people minimum, has been legitimized in part through this sort of propaganda which claims that Palestinian suffering and victimhood is a false narrative spread through disproportionate Palestinian influence and control. To understand how this could happen, it's important to understand, firstly, what anti-Semitism actually is. It's much more of a belief system and ideology than it is just racism or ethnic hatred or religious hatred against Jews. Though I want to say that a lot of people make the argument, well-meaning people make the argument that Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims cannot be anti-Semitic because they themselves are mostly Semitic. And while this is technically true, the term anti-Semitism has, over the centuries, simply come to be understood as meaning hatred against Jews specifically. That doesn't say anything about whether you are truly Semitic or not. It's just how we understand the word. Words do not always mean what they seem like they mean literally, especially not in English. What a weird language. With that out of the way, it is important to understand that this sort of repurposing of anti-Semitism against Arabs is very easy to do for a fairly simple reason. And that is that for European anti-Semites of the 18th and 19th centuries, the very reason why Jews came to be known as Semitic, as this sort of category of person, came out of the scientific racism of the 18th and 19th centuries, where efforts were being made to categorize peoples of the world, the ethnic groups of the world, into different supposed races or groups, and claiming that Jews were a Semitic people was an implication that they did not belong in Europe. It was a way to say that they were more like Arabs, like a hated historical enemy, and thus did not belong and could never belong in Europe. You can actually see this in the etymology of the word, anti-Semitism, where particularly in Germany and France throughout the 19th century, the word was actually mostly used in a positive sense. For example, there was a political party in Germany called the Anti-Semitic League, and they were very proud of their hatred of Jews. So given that a huge part of the origin of the term anti-Semitic comes from this effort to say that Jews are like Arabs and therefore are outsiders, it really isn't surprising that anti-Semitic tropes can so fluidly be applied to Arabs and Muslims today, because that was the very point of it in the first place, to say that Jews were like Arabs and Muslims and therefore did not belong. When you go to almost any pro-Israel organization's website, they will have a list of anti-Semitic tropes. A lot of these tropes have sort of been invented recently. For example, comparing Israel to the Nazis is something that a lot of these websites will claim is anti-Semitic, but a lot of them are a lot more historical and a lot more part of the core belief system of anti-Semitism, which is pretty much designed from the very beginning to scapegoat one group of people in society and redirect and project broader problems with that society onto them. So if you look at the American Jewish Committee website, and this is an organization that is very openly pro-Israel and Zionist, they have a list of anti-Semitic tropes. And while around half of these are essentially just them attempting to equate being anti-Israel and anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, some actual anti-Semitic tropes are still listed here, a lot of which you can very clearly see being utilized against Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians today. For example, there is dual loyalty, and they say this is a bigoted trope that is used to cast Jews as the other, and it involves accusing Jews of being disloyal citizens whose true allegiance is to Israel or a hidden Jewish agenda. And through this, anti-Semites sow distrust and spread harmful ideas like the belief that Jews are a traitorous fifth column, meaning that they are undermining their country from within. So this sounds precisely like what is presently being done to Muslims in Europe, not just more often, but to much greater effect than how it is presently being used against Jews. And that shows very well how these sorts of tropes can be utilized against another group, but in particular they can be utilized very easily against Muslims and Arabs. And note the particular obsession that they have here as well of linking all of this specifically to criticism of Israel. As I said, most of these organizations are far more invested in framing criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic than they are in actually just denouncing anti-Semitism. Another trope that is mentioned here is Jewish features: large curved noses, curly or red hair, horns, dark eyes with drooping lids. These sorts of caricatures have been utilized against Arabs for an extremely long time as well. I found a number of them from the 70s, for example. But they are especially being revived today, in large part by pro-Israel people. You may have seen this cartoon recently released by the French magazine Charlie Hebdo, but which seems almost like a spitting image of the infamous anti-Semitic caricature that is commonly known online as the Happy Merchant. This list also includes the depiction of Jews as vermin, a tactic which has been commonly utilized by Israel and pro-Israel influencers during the Gaza genocide, with both Palestinian leaders and Palestinians in general being depicted as rats or cockroaches. On the list is also the trope of control, false reports that claim Jews control the media, banks, and governments, portraying them as secret puppet masters manipulating the world's economies and governments, which are part of a long-standing conspiracy of secret Jewish power. This is a trope that, as I have emphasized, is currently being utilized by Israel itself in its own propaganda, regardless of how absurd it is to claim that Palestinians are largely downtrodden and poor people could ever have such power. In this case, there are not so much claims of them controlling banks, but Zionists certainly seem to believe that there is a Palestinian control, even of the mainstream media that usually favors them, and that they have pervasive influence over world governments. In particular, they've been saying this lately regarding South Africa and global institutions such as the UN, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. Another trope listed here is the anti-Semitic trope of Jews being clannish, which they say is an anti-Semitic stereotype which claims that Jews only associate and do business with their own kind, and that they are untrustworthy, aggressive, apathetic, exclusive, and unaccepting of non-Jews and non-Jewish cultures. And you see this presently being utilized regarding Muslim and Arab immigrants, the idea that they do not integrate, that they mostly mingle among themselves, which is used to frame them as a sort of internal enemy population, who are all more or less plotting together to eventually usurp the societies that they are in. Another anti-Semitic trope that is listed here is blood libel, which they claim is the accusation that Jews have murdered non-Jews in order to use their blood in rituals. Now, this trope is not being used one-to-one by Israel, but it is being used very similarly. For example, they have vastly exaggerated claims of atrocities committed by Palestinian militants. One of the initial claims that legitimized the Gaza genocide, for example, was the idea that Palestinian militants had massacred 40 babies in incubators and beheaded them. That is a very clear instance of blood libel used to demonize the Palestinian people and to justify their extermination. And I think that once you know what you're looking for, it is really easy to see some of the most pervasive and dangerous anti-Semitic tropes being utilized against Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians today. And these sort of tropes are ironically most common in Germany and Austria, really, where a part of the idea that the Arab migrants are sort of innate outsiders with dual loyalty comes from the fact that many of them are unwilling to integrate into the national ideology of these two countries, which involves atoning for their guilt for committing the Holocaust by uncritically supporting Israel. And that is then used as an example of how they are a sort of internal enemy. And they themselves are framed as anti-Semitic for this pervasively. So quite ironically, dishonest claims of anti-Semitism are now being utilized to quite anti-Semitically treat a group of people as internal enemies with dual loyalties. And all of this is absurdly dangerous. What Israel has done in Gaza has shown plainly what the result of this sort of rhetoric can be if it is allowed to extend to its logical conclusion. And it's precisely the same sort of conclusion that the Nazis came to due to their own anti-Semitic beliefs. If there is a group that is painted as an eternal internal enemy, then eventually there will be a drive to get rid of them. And what are the options for getting rid of them? Deportation or killing. Israel cannot simply deport the Palestinians, as the Palestinians are in their own land. Hence its killing of them in Gaza and its endeavor to confine them in Gaza and the West Bank to as small of an area as possible. No one expects better on this from the Israelis. I think everyone already knows that they were genocidal against Palestinians. But in Europe, this sort of thing can still be stopped before it gets to the point that those spreading it can carry out what they ultimately want to do, even if they are afraid to say it out loud at this point. Westerners love to performatively denounce Islamophobia, while at the same time doing everything that they can to demonize Muslims and Arabs in general, as well as Palestinians. The fact of the matter is that currently, right now, as I said at the beginning, anti-Semitic tropes are being utilized to much greater effect against Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims than they are against Jews. There is actual real systemic danger of this anti-Semitic belief system being applied to Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians in ways that can only lead to atrocities. But ultimately, it seems like many Westerners, and especially Western politicians, took the wrong lesson from the phrase, never again. They seem to think that what it meant was never again for our allies or for those convenient to us, not never again for everyone. Thanks for watching. And if you really liked this video and are actually thinking of becoming a member of the Bad Empanada International Gang Stalking Criminal Ring, you can do that by sending me a monthly monetary contribution on Patreon or Ko-fi, or sending me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. Now I'd just like to thank all of my gang stalkers, but especially my $25 plus gang stalkers, Jordy, Alexa Nopt, Communist Functionary, S, the Son of Sandy, Ya Makamut Ya Habib, Jakogora, Lucian, Osman Malik, Qualia, Robocommy, Brosnan, Jel Cribson, Christian Corniels, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Eric Makdans, Yugopnik, Nabiru, B, Johnny Rocket, Firefox 42, Happy Nephron, Minijan, Eric Perkins, Ant, Max Halland, Jack Paul, Louis Bravo, Kieran Goodwin, Megan Lowndes. God, I have a lot of gang stalkers. Soyborn, Comrade Napule, Clement Fudge, Hector Obregon, Asma B, Support Libraries, Jizdog, Cockled Badger, T Street, Aramis Goodspiel, Noah Larson, You Can Change Your Name, Bicep, Gavagundam 4444, Bubbly T, Adrian Nesu, The Big L, Goyo, Lorenzino, Lee Breeze, Robin, Gareth Miguel, K, Pacifist 2346, Mira, Atuin, Urculano, and the Empanada Brigades. Thanks again for watching, and make sure to show up Thursday for our weekly gang stalking debriefing.